In November 1911, night watchman Thomas Whitlock made a discovery that should have changed everything. Hidden behind the grinding machinery of Manchester's Beckwith Cotton Mill, he found room 419, a space that didn't exist on any blueprint. Inside were belongings of 23 children he'd meticulously logged entering the factory gates of the previous 6 months. Children who never came back out, but Thomas Whitlock would vanish the night before he was supposed to testify about what he found in that room. Thomas Whitlock was 47 years old, a methodical man who'd spent the last 15 years of his life guarding the Beckwith Cotton Mill. His wife Sarah would pack him the same dinner every night: cold mutton sandwiches, wrapped in brown paper, and a thermos of black tea that he'd sip while making his rounds. He had one quirk that everyone knew about. He kept detailed logs of everything. Not just the required security reports, but personal notebooks where he'd record the weather, the number of cats he saw prowling the yard, which workers arrived late, and which children looked too young to be working the looms. And so Thomas had noticed something troubling in the spring of 1911. The mill employed dozens of children, some as young as 8 years old, and Thomas knew most of them by name. He'd watched them trudge through the gates at dawn, their small hands already rough from working the cotton. But starting in May, he began noticing children he didn't recognize. They'd arrive before dawn, always through the east gate, always accompanied by a man in a gray coat whom Thomas had never seen before. The first was a boy named William Hartley, aged 9, with a pronounced limp. Thomas wrote in his log, May 3rd, 5:47 a.m., unknown boy, brown hair, limping, blue work shirt too large for frame, accompanied by gray coat man, did not exit with evening shift. Thomas waited by the gates that evening, counting every worker as they streamed out. William Hartley never emerged. Over the next 6 months, Thomas documented 22 more children following the same pattern. Emma Croft, aged 7, with distinctive red hair. The Donnelly twins, both 10, who clutched each other's hands as they passed through the gates. Margaret Shaw, 11, who'd been crying. Each arrived before dawn. Each was logged entering. None ever left. Therefore, Thomas began investigating on his own time. He'd checked the work rolls, but these children's names never appeared. He'd walked through the mill during his rounds, scanning the rows of child workers at the looms, but never spotted any of the missing 23. When he mentioned it to the floor supervisor, Marcus Blackwood, the man's face went cold. "Mind your gates, Whitlock." Nothing more. But Thomas couldn't let it go. His own daughter Alice had died of scarlet fever 5 years earlier. She would have been 12 now, working age. Maybe that's why he noticed the children more than others did. Maybe that's why he kept such careful records. And maybe that's why, on the night of November 14th, 1911, he decided to search the one part of the mill he'd never been allowed to enter. The restricted section lay behind the main weaving floor, past the thundering mechanical looms that never stopped. Thomas had always been told it was additional storage, too dangerous for regular patrols due to unstable flooring. But that night he noticed something wrong. Fresh mud tracks led from the restricted door as small footprints, child-sized. And so Thomas used his master key and entered the forbidden section for the first time in 15 years. The corridor beyond was narrow and dark, lit only by his gas lamp. The sound of the machinery was muffled here, creating an eerie quiet. He followed the mud tracks down a series of turns that didn't match his mental map of the building. The mill was large, but not this large. These passages seemed to extend beyond the building's footprint. The tracks led to a heavy wooden door marked only with the number 419 in fading paint. Thomas's hand trembled as he reached for the handle. From somewhere beyond the door came a sound that made his blood run cold: children crying. But when Thomas pushed open the door, the room was empty. Not just empty of children, but empty in a way that felt wrong. The crying had stopped the instant he'd opened the door, cut off like a gramophone needle lifted from a record. What he found instead made him stagger backward. The room was filled with belongings. Small shoes lined up against one wall, dozens of pairs, work shirts folded neatly on shelves, and on a table in the center, his own logbooks, not copies. His actual personal logbooks from home, including the one he'd written in that very morning. Someone had been watching him. Someone knew exactly what he'd been documenting. Therefore, Thomas realized with growing horror, whoever was taking these children had been monitoring his every move. They knew he was getting close to the truth. Thomas grabbed the most recent logbook and ran. But as he reached the main floor, he found Marcus Blackwood waiting for him, along with 3 other men in expensive suits. "Ah, Thomas," Blackwood said calmly. "We've been expecting you." But Thomas was already backing toward the exit. "Those children, what have you done with them?" "Nothing that concerns a night watchman," one of the suited men replied. His accent was American, though I'm afraid your employment here has just been terminated. Therefore Thomas did the only thing he could think of. He ran. He burst through the mill doors and didn't stop running until he reached his small house on Denton Street. Sarah was waiting up for him, mending by lamplight. "Thomas, what's wrong? You look like you've seen a ghost." And so Thomas told her everything. About the children, the room, the belongings. Sarah's face grew paler with each word. "We need to go to the police," she whispered, but that wasn't even the worst part. When Thomas returned to room 419 the next morning with 2 constables, the room was completely empty. Not just cleared, the walls had been freshly whitewashed, the floor scrubbed clean. It looked like it had never been used at all. The constables exchanged glances. One tapped his temple when he thought Thomas wasn't looking. But Thomas had kept meticulous records, and those couldn't be so easily erased. He spent the next week compiling everything: dates, times, descriptions, the names of every child. He discovered something that changed everything. The gray coat man who brought the children matched the description of a known trafficker named Silas Brennan, who operated ships between Liverpool and South America. And so Thomas' uncovered next made him realize the scope was bigger than he'd imagined. Documents at the shipping offices showed that Brennan's ships made regular stops at mills across northern England, always leaving with textile cargo. But the weight manifests didn't match. The ships were carrying something much lighter than cotton bales, something human-sized. And this is where the story takes its darkest turn. Thomas found connections between Beckwith Mill's owners and a network of businessmen in Argentina, Brazil, and Chile, men who owned plantations and mines where child workers were in high demand, and life expectancy was measured in months, not years. The children entering through that east gate weren't being put to work in the mill. They were being collected, held in room 419, and shipped overseas where no one would ever look for them. The authorities finally listened when Thomas presented his evidence. A trial was scheduled for December 1st, 1911. Thomas was to be the key witness. The night before the trial, Sarah begged him not to testify. "These are powerful men, Thomas. Think of what they might do." But Thomas kissed her forehead and said, "I think of Alice. I think of those 23 children. I have to speak for them." He left the house at 10 p.m. to meet with the prosecutor one final time. Sarah would never see him again. A mill worker found Thomas's body in the Manchester Ship Canal 3 days later. The official report listed it as accidental drowning, despite the heavy chains wrapped around his ankles. The trial proceeded without Thomas Whitlock. Without their key witness, prosecutors struggled. Marcus Blackwood testified that Whitlock had been unstable, prone to fantasies. The American businessman produced documents suggesting Whitlock had gambling debts, implying he'd fabricated the story for reward money. But then Sarah Whitlock did something unexpected. She produced Thomas's final journal, one he'd hidden beneath their floorboards the night he disappeared. In it, he documented everything, including names and addresses of every conspirator, details of the trafficking routes, and most crucially, a hand-drawn map of the mill's hidden passages. The map revealed a network of rooms beneath Beckwith Mill, connected to old mining tunnels that led directly to the canal. Room 419 was just one of many holding areas. Thomas had written, "If something happens to me, know that at least 200 children have passed through these rooms in the last 2 years. They're shipped out monthly. The next shipment is December 15th. Therefore, police raided the mill on December 14th. In the underground rooms, the stench of human waste and fear hit them, first a smell that made seasoned officers gag. They found 17 children locked in the darkness, including Emma Croft, the red-haired girl Thomas had logged 7 months earlier. She was skeletal, traumatized but alive. When they carried her into daylight, she shielded her eyes and whispered her first words in months. "Are the ships coming?" Time had lost meaning in those windowless rooms. She thought only days had passed, not 7 months. The businessman fled before police arrived. Marcus Blackwood was arrested but hanged himself in his cell before trial. Silas Brennan, the man in the gray coat, was never found. The mill owners paid modest fines and claimed ignorance of the entire operation. Beckwith Mill closed permanently in 1912, though locals reported seeing lights in the building for decades afterward. Of the 23 children Thomas had documented, only Emma Croft ever came home. Sarah Whitlock received Thomas's final paycheck and a small pension from the mill blood money, she called it, but she had no choice but to accept it. She spent the rest of her life trying to locate the missing 22 children, writing letters to authorities in Argentina, Brazil, and Chile that were never answered. In her final years, Sarah would often speak to Alice's photograph on the mantel, telling her daughter how her father had tried to save other children because he couldn't save her. "He saw you in every one of them," she'd whisper. Every child who walked through those gates. Emma Croft, the sole survivor from Thomas's list, was reunited with her family, but she never spoke about what happened in those underground rooms. She'd wake screaming about the gray coat man, about ships and darkness, and the sound of other children crying. Her parents found her one morning in 1913 standing at their door, dressed and ready to leave. When they asked where she was going, she said simply, "He's calling us back." They never let her out of their sight again. The Beckwith Mill still stands in Manchester, converted now to luxury apartments. Residents occasionally report hearing children crying behind the walls, though the building's promotional materials don't mention its history. Room 419 is now someone's kitchen. The current owner says she's never used the oven. It always smells like salt water and fear. Thomas Whitlock's journals are preserved in the Manchester Central Library's restricted archives. His map of the underground passages has never been verified. The tunnels, if they existed, were sealed long ago, or so the city claims.